Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and here is the set review for all of the blue cards in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. We've already done red, black, green. I'm going to link links to those videos in the description below so that you guys can check those out if you're interested. And the rest of the colors are on the way. So before we get into the blue cards, really quick, I just want to ask, like the video. Please like the video. It helps the video get out to so many more people, and it helps me a ton, and it's just such a simple thing. So please like the video, subscribe if you're new, because we have tons of content coming, tons of really cool deck techs we're going to hit the ground running with as soon as this set launches on Arena, so lots of cool stuff on the way. But with all of that out of the way, let's move on to the blue cards. This is Archmage's Noot. Archmage's Noot? Let me know in the comments. This is a 2/2 Salamander mount for 1 blue and 1. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. Now that happens no matter what, but if it's saddled, the flashback cost is 0, and it saddles for 3. That means you can tap any number of creatures with power totaling 3 in order to make the Noot become saddled until end of turn. You can only do that as a sorcery. And then you swing in. If you do that, whatever you're gonna give flashback to, you can play for 0. Otherwise, you have to pay the flashback cost equal to its mana cost, which is also kind of fine. I think this card is really good. It's a little difficult for it to get through, but all you have to do is set yourself up with a way for this to get through, and you can get a ton of value. I dread the idea of using this with any kind of extra turn cards where you can just start to reuse them from the graveyard for flashback 0. As long as you can hit through once, right, you can get another turn, and then you can make sure you hit through again. And if you have some way of continuously populating your graveyard with those sorts of cards, that could turn into an auto-win combo, which could be kind of crazy, but you don't even have to go that far with it, right? You could do things like discard a Breach the Multiverse and then cast it for free, or even just play this in, you know, a Spell Slinger deck where you don't care about casting stuff for free, but just getting to recast some of your really cheap spells, re-trigger prowess and stuff like that could be really good. So I think this guy's actually a pretty good card. Pretty good. No awards, but it's a pretty good card. Next up we have Canyon Crab. This is a 0/5 crab for 1 blue and 1. You can pay 2 mana to give it +2/-2 until end of turn, and at the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, you draw a card and then discard a card. This card's okay. It's important to note that even though it's a 0/5, it does not have Defender, so this can come down and be a really good blocker early. And then a little bit later in the game, when you actually need it to be an attacker, you could swing in, you know, use it as a mana sink, dump some extra mana into it, swing as a 2/3 attacker, or maybe even a 4/1 attacker, depending on the circumstances. You can also just swing as a 0/5, and then wait to pump it, depending on if they block or not, which is also kind of cool. So there's a lot of, like, little ways to get silver lining value out of this card. I think it probably works best in a deck with a lot of flash and or plot cards, because if you're plotting stuff from your hand, putting it into exile, that doesn't count as casting a spell, and then when you play it from exile the next turn, it doesn't count as casting a spell from your hand. So none of the plot interactions will get around this ability triggering. You're always going to be able to make sure this triggers when you're using plot. Same thing with flash. You know, if you can just flash stuff in on your opponent's turn, you never have to worry about casting a spell on your turn. You can always get this draw a card, discard a card, this loot ability to trigger at the end of turn. So that's a little bit of extra value. So if you're deep into those archetypes, this is going to be a really good grab, I think. But even just in a blue deck that wants to be very defensive at first and hold off aggro, you know, and then actually have something that can be a valuable piece of board real estate a little bit later in the game because of the mana sink, it's a pretty decent card. Next up we have Daring Thunder Thief, 1 blue and 3 for a 4/4 Turtle Rogue with Flash. When it enters the battlefield, it enters tapped. Now that's kind of a bummer, but the flash still makes it kind of good, right? You can wait until the end of their turn and you can still hold up your mana to do things like instant speed removal, or activate abilities, and then in situations where you don't have to, you can just use your mana to flash this in at end of turn, and then immediately you take your turn, you untap, and you can swing with a 4/4 for 4. So you can't do the normal crazy shenanigans that blow out the opponent by flashing it in as a blocker or anything like that, but you can still get extra value off this for having the flash. So it's almost like half flash in a way. It coming in tapped feels like it's half flash. It's not as good as a full-on flash creature, but it's definitely better than a normal vanilla creature that doesn't have any flash at all. So kind of interesting. Probably not going to be a high pick, but pretty cool card. Next up we have Deep Muk Desperado, a 2/4 Homarid mercenary. Welcome back, Homarids. For 1 blue and 2. Or is it Homarid? I think it's Homarid. Let me know in the comments. Whenever you commit a crime, each opponent mills 3 cards. This ability triggers only once each turn. This guy is going to be the core of a mill archetype for sure in Limited. So you got to look out for this guy. If you can get one of these super early and get really deep into it right from the get-go and know that you're going to be in mill, that deck could be really powerful. If you have a chance of like snagging 2 of these at one draft table for the same deck, that deck's going to be insane. It's really easy to commit crimes. You can commit crimes just by casting removal spells, which is what you want to be doing anyway, and it's probably what you want to be doing in a mill deck, because if you can just control the board, keep all their threats off of it until they run out of cards, you'll win. So the combination of this ability being super easy to trigger and, you know, it being a good defender and you being able to trigger it with things that you want to be doing anyway, I think that deck's going to be scary and one to look out for in Limited. So keep your eyes open for that. Go into it deep if you can get one super early. Otherwise, maybe consider hate picking this later on so that you don't have to face multiple copies of this in one of your opponent's decks. Next up, we've got Djinn of Fool's Fall. 1 blue and 4 for a 4/3 Djinn with flying, which is already kinda decent as a common top end, like, we just need some evasion at the top end of our deck that can count as a win condition, right? That's already not bad. But you can also plot it for 1 blue and 3 so that you can keep it in exile and just play it for free on a later turn. So if you have some extra mana sitting around, you have this in your hand, you haven't hit your 5th land drop yet, but you don't have anything better to play. Maybe you have removal in your hand and they don't have any good creatures or whatever. You can just take a turn and plot this out, and then whenever it makes sense, you can just play it for free and have this 4/3 flying beat stick that you can help win the game with. So I think this is pretty good. It's probably one of the higher picks for commons, but it's not going to be like a super high pick or anything like that. Next up, we have Double Down. 1 blue and 3 for an enchantment. Whenever you cast an outlaw spell, you copy that spell. I have a feeling this is going to be a lot better than we saw a very similar card back during Innistrad, which is still standard legal. It's crazy that those sets are still standard legal, but there was a similar card to this, same mana cost and everything, that made copies of zombies when you played them. I think this is a lot better because you need to remember that outlaws aren't just one creature type. It's a compilation of 5 creature types, so there's 5 times as many cards that can trigger Double Down as could trigger that zombie version, right? So I think the chances that this is more useful and could see play go way up because of that. That being said, it is kind of a 4 mana do nothing, right? And that was always the problem with cards like this, is the turn you play them, if you're playing them early enough for you to still have a bunch of outlaws in your hand, then you're wasting an entire turn playing this, right? You probably don't have any mana left over to do anything else. But if you wait until later where you don't have to waste the whole turn playing this, you're out of outlaws in your hand that you can no longer play. So it's kind of a bummer. The one silver lining to this that means it might see play in Standard is if you're in like some kind of an outlaw tribal deck that's really heavy on plot creatures, you could spend the first couple turns plotting creatures into exile, then slam a Double Down, maybe followed by a sweeper the next turn just to make up for all the tempo loss from plotting everything. But then you've got Double Down down, you've got a whole bunch of free outlaws in exile that can all just come down right after your sweeper and trigger this and get multiple copies and go ham. So that could be a deck. At the end of the day, I don't know if it's going to be quite good enough, but I do think it's the best possible type of deck to use this in. And I am going to mess around with trying to brew it. If it ends up being good enough, we'll put it up on the channel, that brew, for sure. Next up, we have Duelist of the Mind. And this is actually my pick for runner-up. Second best card in blue for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. This is a star power 3 toughness human advisor with flying and vigilance for only 1 blue and 1, which is crazy. Its power is equal to the number of cards you've drawn this turn, so it's always going to be at least a 1/3 flying vigilance for 2 on your turn because you draw your card for the turn, and at least a 0/3 flying blocker on their turn because of the vigilance, which that in and of itself, with the ability to scale and make the power even bigger if you have anything at all that's drawing you extra cards during your turns, that's pretty crazy. But then it has this other ability that whenever you commit a crime, you may draw a card. If you do discard a card, this ability triggers only once each turn. So you can do that once on your turn, and if you want to, you can do that once on their turn. And when you're committing a crime, not only are you drawing, discarding, and getting that value, but it's also counting as drawing a card and making the power of Duelist of the Mind go up by 1 for that turn. So there's a lot of synergy there. It's very easy to commit crimes. I feel like a broken record at this point, just by doing things you want to be doing anyways, like using normal removal and stuff like that. So I think it's very easy for this guy to be super, super powerful. I think what makes him really over the top and makes him get to that point where he's the runner-up, the second best card in blue for me, is just how well he pairs with Raffine. And, you know, Esper midrange is like one of the big meta decks in Standard right now. Raffine is everywhere, and this just slots in perfectly, right? You play this on 2, you play Raffine on 3. Whenever you swing, for each trigger you get off Raffine that's going to connive and draw you a card, all of those are going to trigger Duelist and make the power go up. So not only are you putting counters on from Raffine's ability to begin with when she connives, but you're also kind of doubling the amount of power you get out of that by making Duelist of the Mind's power go up. And then don't forget, it also has vigilance, which means like against aggro decks, you can safely block a 1 or 2 power creature as well and save yourself some damage without sacrificing the ability to get in for a bunch of damage and to get in and trigger Raffine and all that kind of stuff. So this card's insane. It is my pick for runner-up. It's absolutely going to take a spot in Esper midrange moving forward, and I wouldn't be surprised if that deck starts to get a little more attention. It's kind of dropped off a little bit recently. There were just a couple other decks that were more notable, both because they're newer, like Boros Convoke, or just have more top end, like, you know, Domain Ramp, stuff like that. But I really think this card's going to turn some heads, and I wouldn't be surprised if people start really taking Esper more seriously again because of the inclusion of this card. Next up, we have Emergent Haunting, 1 blue and 1 for an enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, and Emergent Haunting isn't a creature, it becomes a 3/3 spirit creature with flying in addition to its other types. Now, what's cool about that is it becomes that forever. But it triggers at the beginning of your end step, so it does take a little bit of setup. So you jam this on 2. At any turn after that, that you can just plot something from your hand and not cast a spell, or if you're playing like Flash Tribal, you just say go and cast your stuff on their turn. Either of those scenarios, this is just going to become a 3/3 flyer forever. So in the right decks, this can be a very cheap 3/3 flyer that can put a lot of pressure on the opponent or give you a lot of defensive options earlier in the game than otherwise you might have. But also having that mana sink of being able to just dump 3 mana into it to surveil 1 if you happen to have extra leftover mana that you can't use for more useful things is some nice gravy as well. I think this is going to be pretty good in the decks that support plot and flash for the limited archetype for sure. I think it's going to be a relatively high pick once you know that you're in that archetype. Before that, it's kind of a middle of the road. You really have to be able to turn this on consistently for it to be a good pick. Next up, we have Esoteric Duplicator. This is actually my pick for the sleeper card of the set. And that being said, there are a few people who seem to realize how good this can be. So this isn't like the ultimate sleeper ever, but I think most of the Magic community doesn't realize how good this can be. This is 1 blue and 2 for an artifact clue. Yes, it is a clue. So you can pay 2 and sack it to draw a card like any clue, which is kind of interesting. But whenever you sacrifice it or another artifact, you may pay 2. If you do, at the beginning of the next end step, you create a token that's a copy of that artifact. So the obvious place you can put this is something like Grixis Anvil. You know, use Oni-Cult Anvil, and every time you're sacking to the Anvil to get stuff, you have the option to paying 2 mana to get back the thing that you sacked, which is really, really cool. But where this card starts to really take off is using it with things that either have strong ETBs or things that you're gonna have to sacrifice anyway. So like one example would be the Mightstone and the Weakstone. Once you have a Mightstone and Weakstone out with an Esoteric Duplicator, you can tap it for 2 colorless, and then sack it to something, right? And pay the 2 colorless that you made with the Might and Weakstone by tapping it to make a copy. And then when it comes back into play, you immediately have access to 2 more mana from it if you need it. But also you get to either draw the 2 cards or, you know, kill their big creature or whatever. So being able to do that every turn for essentially free because that card makes 2 mana is pretty nutty. But also being able to use this with like anything that makes token copies, like artifact token copies of big stuff that, you know, have that clause where you have to sacrifice it at the end of turn, you don't get to keep it. Well, now you can just pay the extra 2 mana and get a copy of it into play that stays forever, which is also kind of insane. There's a lot of cards in this set. There's a lot of support for that kind of synergy. So we already had 2 mana Saheeli, right, that can do stuff like that, along with the other cards in this set that can do more of that. That might be a deck right there. We're gonna explore it for sure as soon as the set drops, and there's some interesting stuff you can do with this card. So this is my pick for the sleeper of the set. Next up we have Failed Fording. 1 blue and 1 for an instant. Return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If you control a desert, surveil. This is filler removal for blue. If you're desperate and you need some sort of removal, this is going to help gain you a little bit of a tempo advantage, set your opponent back a little, and then if you happen to have a desert, you also get a little bit of extra value that you can dig a card, get 1 card closer to your next bomb or your land drop or whatever. So not bad, but it is definitely filler. You're going to pick it up later in a draft, and you're going to, you know, include it as your 22nd, 23rd card if you happen to be a little short on removal. It's also worth noting there's some really cool ETB triggers in this set, so if you're in that sort of ETB-centric, trying to do a lot of flickering, if you're in that kind of archetype in Limited, this might go up in value a little bit as something that can double as not only being that removal, but also being a way to replay powerful ETB triggers. And if you have that versatility and that option of using this for either way, in that specific archetype in Limited, it's going to be a little bit better than it otherwise would be in any other blue deck, so keep that in mind. Next up we have Fibble Thip, Lost on the Range. I really wanted to give this guy an award, but alas, there are better cards. 2 blue and 1 for a 1/1 legendary homunculus. It has Ward 2, which is nice. This helps make sure it can survive at least 1 turn cycle so that you can use it at least once before your opponent can deal with it. Not strictly. There are a couple cards that can deal with Fibble Thip around the Ward 2 on curve, but for the most part, he's protected to get at least one use out of him. While he's on the battlefield, you may look at the top card of your library at any time. The top card of your library has Plot. The plot cost is equal to its mana cost, and you may plot non-land cards from the top of your library. So, the first thing that people think when they see this and they're down on the card and they don't like it is like, well, if the plot cost is the same as their mana cost, why wouldn't I just wait to draw the card and just play it normal, since I'm not going to be able to play it from exile until next turn if I plot it anyway? And my answer to that would be because you get card advantage, right? Every single thing that you plot off the top with Fibble Thip is a card that wasn't in your hand, is a card that you don't need to waste a draw on. So if you're looking for a card advantage engine where you can just play stuff off the top, plot it off the top as much as possible until you're out of mana, so that you can keep everything that's in your hand and not run out of gas anytime soon, this is pretty good for that. Once he starts to get rolling too, it's like you're spending every turn playing a bunch of free stuff that you plotted last turn, and you're able to still plot a bunch of stuff this turn to set up for next turn. So once you get the value engine rolling, it's like you've constantly got spells ready to be played for 0. It's just, you have to plan ahead, and you have to do it ahead of time. So very interesting engine here, and then it gets really crazy with anything that has like ETB triggers, anything that triggers off of like creatures entering the battlefield or spells being played, like prowess, stuff like that. You can plot a whole bunch of stuff and not even cast it next turn, just pile it up and wait, and then eventually play your, War Leader's Call, followed by your 10 creatures that trigger it, for free in the same turn, which could be crazy. Or your Prowess Haste creatures, and then play your 7 spells from exile that you've been hoarding to trigger all of the prowess ever, all on one turn, and just Alpha Strike for the win. So there's a lot of cool things this can set up, but it does take a little bit of foresight. It takes a little bit to get there. Next up, we have Fleeting Reflection. This is 1 blue and 1 for an instant. Target creature you control gains hexproof until end of turn. Untap it, and until end of turn, it becomes a copy of up to 1 other target creature. I don't hate this card, but this card is not as good as it looks on the surface. And that's because typically the most important thing you can do with this card is use it as a way to protect your creature. If they try to use removal on your dude, you give it hexproof and now it doesn't die, right? And this is a 2-mana instant way of doing that, which is a little bit below rate because we're used to getting that kind of an ability for 1 mana. And the upside of being able to turn any creature into a copy of any other target creature is really good. But the fact that you have to target the same creature with both of these abilities is what kind of makes it a little weird. Because normally if your opponent's using removal on your creature and you need to protect it, they're targeting your best creature. So, do you really want to turn your best creature into a copy of something else until end of turn when you're giving it hexproof to protect it? Probably not. So I don't think the 2 modes really line up super well together to be used at the same time. That being said, it's still decent to use, almost like a charm, where depending on the situation you can give something hexproof to save it, or you could make your little guy become a copy of a bomb so that you can like win the game or get some kind of value that way. So it's not useless, it is good, it's just not as good as it looks, and you have to kind of keep in mind the different play lines you can utilize while playing this card in order to get the most out of it. So be a little careful when you're drafting it, but it's still a useful tool in draft for sure, and can probably win some games. Next up we have Geral the Flesh, a mono blue version of Geralf. A 2/3 legendary human warlock for 1 blue and 2. Whenever you cast a spell during your turn, other than the first spell that turn, you make a 2/2 zombie. And then whenever a zombie enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on it for each other zombie that entered the battlefield under your control this turn. So, at the very least, if you play this in like the double spell archetype and you're able to play, at least 1 zombie and then another spell, that second spell is going to create a zombie token that's then going to get a +1/+1 counter from the zombie that you played as your first spell. That's kind of like the floor. That's the floor you should be aiming for, at least if, you pack 1, pick 1 this and try to draft into it as an archetype in Limited. But the ceiling's pretty high on this, and for Constructed, it might be possible to do some gross stuff, because if you can, like, plot a whole bunch of cards, especially if they're zombies, into exile, and then play them all in the same turn, that ability starts to get exponential, right? If you play a zombie, and then you play 3 other spells after that, the second spell gives you a 3/3 token, the third gives you a 4/4 token, the fourth gives you a 5/5 token, in addition to whatever those spells are to begin with, right? And you can just vomit all of that out on the same turn with something like Plot. And if any of those spells are zombies themselves, then you're getting additional counters from that as well. It can get really crazy. So I don't know if it's going to be quite good enough. It takes a lot of setup, it takes a lot of foresight, but there's a chance that something like that could exist in Standard, and it's really interesting. I don't know if we're going to quite go there. I think eventually we might try to brew this, but it's not one of like the 10 that I'm like most excited to brew right now, so I don't think it'll be week 1, but eventually I'd like to really dig into this and see what we could do with it. Next up we have Geyser Drake. This is 1 blue and 2 for a 2/3 flying Drake. So it's strictly better than a typical Drake, right? An extra point of toughness there, but also as long as it's not your turn, spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So this is going to make all of your instant speed and flash stuff way cheap, right? You're probably going to be able to double spell a lot easier. So if you're in some kind of a flash deck, or even like a flash double spell hybrid deck, this is going to just give you a ton of value and an ability to really enable that stuff very easily. On top of a body that's not bad. It's not super good. Obviously, we would prefer a 3-power flyer for our 3 mana. But 2/3 flying, not nothing. And then we get this ability that really, really synergizes with some of the archetypes within this set. So pretty good pick for a common. You probably want to pick it up in the last half of a pack, but pretty decently high pick as far as commons go. Specifically if you're trying to go for that archetype where you're going to be able to get the most out of that cost reduction. Next up we have Harrier Strix, 1 blue for a 1/1 flying bird. When it enters the battlefield, you get to tap a permanent, and then you can pay 3 mana to draw a card, discard a card. I like this a lot. This is a way to just get down an early 1/1 flyer, if you need to, that has this ability later on as a mana sink to actually gas you up and get you closer to your bomb, which is a nice little bit of gravy there. It's better gravy than I think most cards get. But then also, if you get this a little bit later in the game, you can actually use it to tap down a blocker so that you can effectively get through and maybe close out the game, as well as getting access to that mana sink. So pretty decent little, common here. It's probably a little bit better in plot decks because sometimes you can create situations where everything's plotted and can be cast for free and you don't have anything to do with your mana. So the chances of being able to use that ability go up. But this is just a little bit of a filler card, right? Next up, we have Jace Reawakened. The man himself is back, and yes, this is my pick for best card. And it's because of ways that I think are underappreciated in the Magic community right now. We're going to go over that in just a bit, but first off, 2 blue mana for a legendary planeswalker with 3 loyalty. The catch is you can't cast him during your first, second, or third turns of the game. So if you're playing this fairly, this is going to come out for 2 mana on turn 4. Keep that in mind. +1, you draw a card, discard a card. That is not great. That is just extra. Pay no attention to that ability. Another +1 loyalty, you may exile a non-land card with mana value 3 or less from your hand. If you do, it becomes plotted. That is the bread and butter. That ability is absolutely insane, and I'll go over a couple ways it can be completely abused in just a little bit. But then it also has an ultimate ability here, -6, and until end of turn, whenever you cast a spell, you copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. It's important to note that when you're exiling things to be plotted, you're gaining loyalty. So you are marching towards this ultimate, even though the ultimate itself is not the end-all be-all. Most of the time, Jace is probably going to be dead before you get to that ultimate, to be honest. He's going to have a huge target on his back. But still, it's nice to know that the best thing you're using this for is always increasing loyalty and getting you closer to that ultimate, so that inevitably at some point you could activate it and get double spells, right, for the whole turn, which could be pretty nutty when you have a bunch of stuff exiled and plotted, ready to be cast for free, that can then be doubled, and you can also use all your mana to cast spells that can be doubled. That could be insane. But let's get back to why this card is actually good to begin with. That other +1 ability where you can plot something with value 3 or less. There's some crazy stuff you can do with this. First of all, anything that has an adventure where the creature side or the permanent side is 3 mana or less, but the adventure is very expensive and provides a ton of value, is going to be insane with Jace. So there's the familiar, right, where you can play the fetch quest for 7 mana, you can plot the familiar, and then play the adventure side for free, which is just insane gas. Just absolute insane gas. You can also do that with the Temur legendary creature that has the adventure. I forget her name right now. Let me know in the comments if you remember. But she's a 3-mana Temur legend. And she has an adventure on her that lets you mill a bunch of cards, and anything with an adventure you put into your hand. So that could be a ton of free value as well. But the other way that you can really take advantage of Jace is using like the expensive base mana cost spree cards. And the best example I can give you is Rush of Dread. Rush of Dread is a black card for 3 mana that has spree costs where for 1 or 2 extra mana each, you can make them get rid of half the creatures they have out rounded up, or half the cards in their hand rounded up, or half their life rounded up. And if you can plot that with Jace, what you're able to do is then play it for free as far as its base costs and only have to pay that extra mana, which means you could pay an extra, 1 mana and make them sack half their board for just 1 mana because the rest of the cards being played for free. Or, 3 mana, make them get rid of half the cards in their hand and sack half their board. If you could just pay the whole 5 mana, which is way less than 8, which is what it would cost to normally do this, you can do all 3 abilities. So, utilizing cards like that to basically get a 3 mana cost reduction on a thing that only costs you 2 mana. And also the thing that about this as well, even though you can't play it until turn 4, it's still only 2 mana. So it comes down on turn 4, but you have 2 mana left up, so you can hold up a counterspell, as well as play the Jace, as well as plot something, and you can protect Jace with the counterspell until your next turn, and that's really important. But even at the end of the day, if all Jace does is use his uptick ability to plot 3 mana board presence cards, things like the cloak that cloaks cards, the artifact, I forget the name off the top of my head. Why am I forgetting that card? I just did so many decks with it. Let me know if you remember in a comment, but there's the 3 mana artifact that cloaks things off the top of your deck. You could play that for free. Urabrask's Forge, you could play that for free. Any kind of board presence you want to use to either stall your opponent or win the game, you can plot these 3 mana things for free, and then leave up all of your mana for interaction. You can leave up all of your mana every turn for counter spells and removal and all that stuff, while still constantly contributing board presence to the board, because you're not paying anything. You're just getting a 3-drop for free every single turn, and the only thing you have to worry about is planning ahead of time for what you're going to get next turn. But once that engine starts going, every turn you're getting something for free that costs 3, so it's kind of crazy. This is just a value engine that lets you hold up all of your mana for your other stuff, and I just think he's insane. I think he's underappreciated. I think people don't realize the extent of how good that plot ability is going to work, and the number of different ways that you can like half break it. And this is my pick for best card in blue, and it's not because it's a Planeswalker or because it's Jace. It's because when you really dig into the abilities, there are ways that it's just insanely good. Nectar of the Gods. Glorious nectar. Back to it. This is Jailbreak Scheme. 1 blue mana for a sorcery with Spree. For an extra 3 mana, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature and it can't be blocked this turn. For an extra 2 mana, target artifact or creature's owner puts it on the top or bottom of their library. This is okay. It is just a common, but it's definitely a filler card. It's definitely primarily meant to be used as a way to, for 3 mana, have this removal that's a little bit better than it looks like, right? The top or bottom of their library is good. If they put it on the bottom of their library, it's essentially better than being exiled or, going to the graveyard, because it's way harder for them to get it back. But if they put it on the top of their library, it's kind of the same as if you played a bounce spell on their creature and also made it so they couldn't draw a card during their next draw step, because they're redrawing the thing, right? So if you think of it like that, it's kind of a really good removal spell either way that it goes, and then it can just be doubled as a way to win the game in the late game if you happen to need to. Oh, I can just make my guy unblockable and make sure he gets in for an extra point of damage as well, which is kind of nice. But then in certain situations, you might be able to utilize both. If you need to get rid of their thing anyway, and you have a bunch of extra mana that you don't have anything to use it on, you can also at the same time just put a +1/+1 counter on your creature that's going to stay forever, and then maybe also make it unblockable so that, you can get in for some damage you otherwise might not have. So, A lot of versatility here. It might make a pretty decent inclusion as like the 22nd, 23rd card, something like that. Next up, we have Loan Shark, 1 blue and 3 for a 3/4 Shark Rogue. When it enters the battlefield, if you've cast 2 or more spells this turn, draw a card, and then it plots for 1 blue and 3. The important thing to note about Loan Shark here is that it can be the second thing that you cast. So for example, if you plot this, and then on your next turn use all of your mana to play 1 big spell, but then you follow that up by playing Loan Shark from exile for free, it is the second spell you cast. So it enters the battlefield, ability triggers when it enters the battlefield. At that point, it's already on the battlefield, the spell has already been cast, counts itself as the second spell, and draws you a card. So being able to plot this basically assures that if you absolutely need to, you can just give yourself a little bit of a tempo loss to make sure you draw that card no matter what, which is kind of key. A 3/4 body for 4 that's also drawing a card to replace itself is pretty good. We haven't seen a creature of that size with an ability like that in blue in quite a while, as far as I can remember. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. But the fact, again, that we have this plot ability to give us more versatility in how we use it and to ensure that we get to draw that card if we absolutely need to is super cool as well. So I think this guy is one of the better picks for commons in your draft deck. So keep that in mind. It's going to be a high pick in common. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a super high pick overall. But it might get picked sometimes over some of the uncommons, to be honest. Next up, we have Marauding Sphinx, talking about good uncommons. This is a 3/5 Sphinx Rogue for 2 blue and 3. It has Flying, Vigilance, and Ward 2. And if that wasn't enough, whenever you commit a crime, you Surveil 2, but this ability triggers only once each turn. This is just a lot of value. This is an uncommon win condition that also shores up your defenses against aggro, and just to a limited extent mid-range, right? A 3/5 flyer, I don't think there's any flyer other than bombs. Outside of bombs, I don't think there's any flyer that's going to be able to get through this guy. And the fact that you have Vigilance so that you can swing in, right, and make sure you put them on an evasive flying clock while still holding back a 5 toughness blocker is nuts. And the Ward 2 means that it's going to be harder to get rid of. This thing is just really good and limited. I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of the better picks to try and shore up like your top end for your win conditions in some kind of a blue deck in limited for sure. But also, committing a crime, Surveiling 2, even though it can only trigger once a turn, is still kind of awesome, because most decks are going to be committing crimes just anyway, right? By using removal and stuff like that. So the fact that every time you do that, you just get to dig 2 cards deeper for your actual bomb is nuts. Surveil, any kind of Surveil Scry is way better in limited. I mean, it's good in any format, but it's particularly good in limited because the decks are so much smaller at 40 cards. So you have less cards to dig through to get to your bombs. So you're almost kind of pulling double duty when you're surveilling as far as trying to get closer to the bombs that you need. And because limited formats are so reliant on bombs these days, just getting to that bomb probably means you win the game. So being able to just Surveil 2 every time you're committing a crime by using removal spells or whatever seems really good as just this free, don't have to really spend any extra mana way of just digging to your bomb so that you can win the game, while also shoring up your defenses with this huge flying body and still winning in it, swinging it in the air to potentially win the game by itself. So this guy's just a lot of value. One of the top picks for uncommon for sure. You should probably pick him pretty high. Next up, we have Metamorphic Blast. 1 blue for an instant with Spree. For an extra 1 mana, until end of turn, target creature becomes a white rabbit with base power and toughness 0/1. For an extra 3 mana, target player draws 2 cards. This card is nuts and limited. Honestly, just having your 4 mana draw 2 card advantage spell in limited that can also be something else if you're getting a lot of pressure and you're trying to survive and you can't afford to take a turn off to pay that 4 mana to draw 2 cards, which most of the time in limited you kind of can. Tends to be a little slower pace. People's decks aren't as consistent as constructed, so that 4 mana to draw those 2 cards to begin with isn't as unreasonable as it would be in constructed. But then on top of that, like, if they are putting pressure on you, this can double as removal. You can use it in combat to choose their guy that you're blocking, or that's blocking your guy maybe, and turn it into a 0/1 so that it dies when otherwise maybe it wouldn't. And maybe your guy survives when otherwise maybe it wouldn't. So really cool combat trick for 2 mana. Make sure you kill something in combat that you otherwise can't, but also card advantage if you don't need to do that. Also both if you just have enough mana to spend 5. Just a lot of versatility here. I think it's a really good pick for Limited. You kind of want both of these abilities in Limited, so the fact that it can be whichever one is best for you, and then also both in the late game, is really good. I would pick this high. I would pick it pretty high. I mean, you're going to have decent creatures in order for the removal part to be good, right? I guess even crappy creatures would still kill the 0/1 for the most part. So yeah, I think you picked this pretty high. Next up we have Nimble Brigand. And this is actually my pick for the best limited card in the set for blue. The best blue limited card in the set. This is a 1/3 human rogue for 1 blue and 2. It can't be blocked if you've committed a crime this turn. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. So this ability on a blue creature is nothing new. We've seen a lot of these. But it's very rare that we get an evasion ability this good with a hoop to jump through that's this easy going, right? Being able to just straight up give it unblockable. It's not flying. It's not any of that, like, maybe it's unblockable. It's just literally unblockable. And then only having to commit a crime to do it, which I've said many times is super easy to do because a lot of the stuff you're going to be wanting to do in your deck anyway, like use creature removal and stuff, is going to allow you to commit crimes. So it's like, every single time you use a piece of removal, this is going to get unblockable and swing in and draw you an extra card. Draw you 1 card closer to your next removal so that you can do it again, right? So it's just really good. And there's some other things outside of removal that can target the opponent and their stuff and commit these crimes as well. So this is just, on the floor, it's really good because even if you can't commit a crime, like if you just happen to be able to get in, you can draw cards. It can defend against aggro a little bit because of the toughness. So even if you're not committing a ton of crimes and super tilted into committing crimes, I think this is a pretty good pick and decently high. But if you know for sure that you're committing a lot of crimes in your deck and you're kind of building into that archetype, this goes way up in value and is probably a first pick. I wouldn't say it would be quite like a pack one, pick one. I think most of your rares and your bombs are going to be worth picking over this, but a very high pick within the first few cards, I think, as long as you know that you're going to be deep into that archetype, right? I don't think it makes you specifically by itself want to go into that archetype, but it's insanely good as support for that archetype if you're going into it. So keep it in mind, pick it high. This is my best pick for limited card in blue for this set. Next up we have Outlaw Stitcher, 1 blue and 3 for a 1/4 human warlock. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 2/2 blue and black zombie rogue creature token, and then you put 2 +1/+1 counters on that token for each spell you've cast this turn other than the first. And it plots for 1 blue and 4, and that's the key. The plot is what makes it good, and there's a reason why the plot cost is 1 more than the normal cost, because the plot makes it so good, right? So you plot this into exile, and you just wait. You just wait. And then on a turn where you can play, even if you don't have anything else plotted, say you can double play, right? You can double spell, double cast, double play a spell in one turn, you know, cast one thing, cast the other thing. I can't talk today. Whatever. You know, cast 2 spells in one turn and then play this from exile for free. Even if you're just doing that, which should be relatively easy to do in limited, you're going to get what? A 6/6? Because it counts itself as a third spell, right? So that zombie's going to be a 6/6. And you got to remember, you're not just getting that zombie token, you're also getting a 1/4, which isn't crazy by itself, especially for the mana you're paying, but as extra juice in addition to that huge zombie, it's great. A 1/4 and a 6/6 for like 5 mana that you paid the turn before is pretty good. It can really help you take over the field, I think. So If you're deep into plot, this gets even better, because obviously if you can plot a bunch of extra cards and then double spell and then play a bunch of plot cards for free and then play this, you could get like a 10/10 zombie. So it only gets better with the more plot that you're utilizing, or the more you're utilizing cheap spells. Maybe you're in the double spell archetype. And I think they did a pretty good job of making cards in this set that can slot into multiple archetypes and be interesting in both. And this card is an example of that, because it can work in the plot archetype, but it can also work in the double spell archetype, where all your spells are really cheap and you're trying to double spell anyway, and that just makes this better. So, pretty cool card. I think it's a decently high pick. It's not like crazy high, but especially high if you're going with a lot of plot cards for sure. Next up, we have Peerless Rope Master, 1 blue and 4 for a 4/4 human rogue. When it enters the battlefield, return up to 1 target tapped creature to its owner's hand. This isn't bad as a common. Like, it's a big body. Granted, it's slightly overcosted big body, but you get to bounce something back to its owner's hand. And it's important to note, like, yeah, you can use this as creature removal. Sometimes you're going to want to slow them down because they're not attacking again with that thing next turn that they attacked with last turn, which is why it's tapped, right? But this can also double as a way to bounce your own stuff, to replay it and get ETBs. And as we know, there is a ton of ETB style support, a ton of flicker and flicker and blink support within this set. There's a lot of things that are trying to do that anyway. So this is a nice like 22nd, 23rd card for your draft deck that can kind of add some extra synergy onto decks that are trying to do that thing, while also having the ability to have a little bit of removal baked in as well if you don't need it for that other way of using it. So pretty cool card. It's not going to be a high pick, but it'll probably see some play in the right archetypes. Next up, we have Phantom Interference. 1 blue for an instant with Spree. For an extra 3 mana, you create a 2/2 white spirit creature token with flying. A 4 mana 2/2 flying is not great, but it is a common, and it does have another mode, and that other mode is for +1 mana, counter target spell unless its controller pays 2. So this is already a pretty on-rate counter spell, right? 2 mana instant speed, counter spell unless they pay 2 is pretty on-rate. So the fact that you also have this other mode where if it's late in the game, you can just pump some extra mana into it and get a 2/2 flyer out of it as well for just 1 card. You're still countering a thing, right? And what's also worth noting is as the game drags on, it gets a little harder to use that counter spell. Getting them in a situation where they don't have the 2 mana untapped gets a little bit harder to pull off, but the ability to spend extra mana to get both of these abilities goes up as you get more and more mana as you get later in the game. So as the main way you want to use it starts to get weaker, the card as a whole starts to get a little bit stronger to kind of compensate for that a little bit. So even if all you do is, you have a ton of mana you don't need for anything else, so you make your 2/2 flyer and you make them pay an extra 2 for their spell, but it still resolves, but now they don't have mana left over for like the removal spell they were going to cast, or they don't have mana left over to play that other creature they wanted to commit to the board, and it helps you get a little tempo advantage. Even if that's all it does later in the game, that's still pretty good if you've got a bunch of mana that you have nothing to do with. So pretty decent. Not great because that creature which you really want is really expensive. I think if it was a +2 for the creature, this thing would be a home run and would be one of the better picks for limited. But as +3 for the creature, it is a little bit situational. That being said, the counterspell's on rate, so great card. Play it. Next up, we have Plan the Heist. 2 blue and 2 for a sorcery. You surveil 3 if you have no cards in hand, and then you draw 3 cards. It also plots for 1 blue and 3. So the idea here is you can just play this like normal, wait until you're out of cards, this is the last card in your hand, and then play it, and not only do you draw 3 cards to gas up, but you get to surveil 3 first, so that you can make sure you're drawing better cards, and potentially maybe putting something in your graveyard that you can use from the graveyard and get extra value with. So a nice little bit of value for when you're out of gas, which is when you normally would want to play something like this anyway. But the fact that it can plot makes it even better, because what you can do is just plot it into exile and let it sit there until you have no cards in hand. In fact, maybe you can spend all of your mana on the next turn, plotting the rest of the cards in your hand so that you have nothing in your hand. But then since this is plotted, you can cast it for free, which now gets you to Surveil because you have nothing in your hand. So there's some cool lines, some cool ways you can line things up to work with this spell. But at the end of the day, it's just pretty good card advantage for blue. I think it's a relatively high pick because card advantage in limited is going to be really important. But it's not like a pack one, pick one or anything like that. It's nothing like that. But you are probably going to want to grab it before it tables. Next up, we have Razzle Dazzler, a 1/2 human wizard for 1 blue and 1. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on him, and it can't be blocked this turn. You know, I want to hate this card. I want to feel like it's just too many hoops to jump through. But with all of the second spell support we've seen, I can't help but feel like this is an actual contender as a win condition. It comes down so unassumedly as a 1/2, but as soon as you just cast your first double spell turn, which if you're in that archetype, you're going to be doing that pretty often, it becomes a 2/3. At that point, your 2 mana for a 2/3, even if you've only double spelled once, is pretty good. And the can't be blocked is just gravy, right? You got your 2/3 for 2 mana. But then, if you can double spell again, it becomes a 3/4, and that's when it's crazy. So the idea that all you got to do is double spell once early in the game, and this is a decent on-rate creature that can block pretty effectively, and then even if it takes you until later in the game to get some more double spells, you can then start to build up more counters and turn this into an actual threat that could close out a game. So the dual nature of how this card can be used, and the fact that you don't need to go super deep on double spelling early, you just need to do it once in order to make this card usable and worth it, is pretty good. But it being a giant unblockable threat later on in the game when you have enough mana to do it more consistently can be kind of crazy. So I actually think this is a decently high pick if you are in that deck. I feel like a broken record saying that about a lot of cards, but outside of being able to consistently being able to second spell, this is not great. This is going to be a very, very last-ditch effort pick. This is filler for sure. But if you are consistently double spelling, if you're going so deep into that archetype that you're doing it almost every turn for sure, this guy is going to be a must include, right? And it's going to be pretty easy to pick up later in the pack, I think. You don't even need to prioritize it. So keep that in mind. Next up, we have Seize the Secrets, 1 blue and 2 for a sorcery. You draw 2 cards, but it costs 1 less to cast if you've committed a crime this turn. So if you have any ways of committing crimes for free, this is 2 mana draw 2, which can be really good. I don't know for sure if there are any ways in common and uncommon in this set that you can commit a crime for free to consistently trigger this in a limited deck. If you can think of something, let me know in the comments. But in Constructed, it's quite possible this sees play. Like, even if you just, on turn 3, cut down their guy, and then use 2 mana to play this and draw 2, that seems really good, right? It's going to take some testing. There are so many good cards in Standard right now, it's really, really hard for anything to make the cut. Like, the bar is so much higher, so I can't say for sure without testing this if it's actually worth the slot. But if we can consistently commit crimes and just draw 2 for 2, like, that could be really powerful. So we're going to have to try it out in Standard for sure. Pretty good card. Next up, we have Shackle Slinger. This is 1 blue and 2 for a 3/2 human soldier. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you choose target creature an opponent controls. If it's tapped, you put a stun counter on it. Otherwise, you tap it. Important thing to note here. You can activate this ability on your turn and on their turn. Granted, that's going to require casting 4 spells every turn cycle. But if you're in an archetype that's utilizing flash cards and plot cards, it's possible to play 2 things for free that you plotted from exile on your turn, right? Tap something down or put a stun counter on it, and then use your mana to cast 2 flash speed or instant speed stuff from your hand on their turn to also tap something down or put a stun counter on something. So you could get a lot of value out of this, and the fact that it's a 3-power creature for 3 and somewhat, not completely on rate, but on rate enough that it can probably trade for their 3-drops as well, I think makes it pretty okay. It is a lot of hoops to jump through. You need to be in, you know, the second spell archetype to really make this thing sing. But there's potential here. There's potential. I don't think it's a super high pick, but I also don't think it's filler. I think it's somewhere in between there. Next up, we have Shifting Grift. This was almost my pick for best limited card, because it can just be so good. Keep in mind, this is an uncommon, right? 2 blue mana for a sorcery has Spree. For an extra 2 mana, you exchange control of 2 target creatures. For an extra 1, exchange control of 2 target artifacts. For another extra 1, exchange control of 2 target enchantments. So, even at its base, even in limited, right, you can just trade your worst creature for their best creature for 4 mana. And it's not a control magic enchantment, and that's important to note, because if you were using an enchantment to do this, like steal their creature by putting an aura on it that makes it yours, they can just get it back by destroying the aura. Shifting Grift, they can't get it back. There's no way. You just take it forever because it's just a sorcery. So in limited, being able to give them your crappy guy, maybe your early 1 mana like 0/3 defender guy that has, you know, you got to the point in the game where he's worn out his welcome and he's not useful anymore, and just take their bomb seems crazy. Or give them like a 1/1 mercenary token and take their bomb seems crazy. If you build around this, it obviously gets better, but even without building around it in limited, you're gonna have a worst creature on the field. And that worst creature is definitely not gonna be anywhere near as good as their best creature. So you're always gonna be able to get value off of this, and I feel like it's that good. But in addition to that, if you have extra mana, and they've got an artifact that you can take, and you've got a crappy artifact token, you can swap those. Same with enchantments, right? So the potential here, even just on the floor, to get their best guy and give them your worst guy, I think is super, super good. It's almost like a counter to bombs in limited, and bombs win limited these days, so having a counter to a bomb is kind of crazy. Even if you don't use it right away and it sits in your hand for a little while, they play their bomb and think they've won, and then you can take it. That could be kind of nuts. But then having all this extra value piled on top where you could get even more stuff depending on the situation is nuts. This is also useful in Constructed, in a deck where you want to give them things and then you get something really good in exchange as well. We have a deck like that I'm brewing. I'm not going to get into the specifics right now because we have a video coming of all the decks that I'm excited about brewing as soon as the set comes out, and you guys will be able to vote on that if you join the Patreon at just $1, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But we'll get to that later, because there is a really cool deck that I'm brewing with this card, and I think you guys are going to like it. It's going to be wild. Next up, we have Simulacrum Synthesizer. 1 blue and 2 for an artifact. Whenever another artifact with mana value 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you make a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token that gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. So every time you cast a 3-drop artifact, it doesn't even have to be cast, right? It just enters the battlefield. So if you get it back with graveyard stuff, or you're somehow able to get it into play for free or whatever, it's going to trigger it. Anytime a 3-drop artifact or more comes into play, you're making another one of these tokens, and every single one of them is as big as however many artifacts you control. And it counts itself, so at the very least it's a 1/1, right? And the Simulacrum. So at the very least it's a 2/2. And wait, the thing with 3 mana that you played. So at the very least it's a 3/3. You're never going to have one that's less than a 3/3 unless you done messed up. But then on top of that, when this enters the battlefield, you get to scry 2, which isn't really necessary, but it's a nice little bit of gravy. What it does do is it helps to ensure that you have an artifact that costs 3 or more lined up to play next turn after you play this. So if you do end up having to play this when you're out of gas, as long as you have one in the top 3, you can make sure you get it. Because if the top 2 doesn't have one, you can put them in the bottom, and if the third card's it, you get that, play that, you're happy. So the right decks, I think this could be crazy. It could be another case of like Thousand Moon Smithy all over again. It might even be a little bit easier to trigger than Thousand Moon Smithy, so this might even be better. This might just be a better Thousand Moon Smithy. It probably goes in the same deck with Thousand Moon Smithy. I don't know. This card just seems kind of crazy in just the right deck. The ability to just go super wide, super quick with huge guys is totally there. The potential is there. I don't know. I got nothing else to say about this card. I just kind of love it. Next up, we got Slick Shot Lockpicker. 1 blue and 2 for a 2/3 human rogue. When it enters the battlefield, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. The flashback cost is equal to its mana cost. You can also plot this for 3. This is awesome because if you rip this guy off the top of your deck late game and you have enough mana, you can just play it and just get back an instant or sorcery to play. Just boom, just get it. Almost like a Snapcaster Mage, right? But if you're not quite there yet, if you only have a limited amount of mana right now, or maybe the spell that you want to double play, maybe you have something bomby in your hand that you haven't cast yet, it's not in your graveyard yet, you can just plot this and let it sit there in exile and wait until the perfect opportunity. Well, now you have a good card in the graveyard, or now you have enough mana to do the thing. Then you just play this for 0 and replay whatever from the graveyard. So it's kind of Snapcastery, but it could be for 0. It just seems really good. Play the card. It's good. Next up, we have Slick Shot Vault Buster. A 1/4 human rogue for 1 blue and 2 with Vigilance. He gets +2/+0. She gets? He gets? I'm not sure. +2/+0 as long as you've committed a crime this turn. I actually kind of like this. If you're in that deck that's committing crimes all the time and trying to get those payoffs, this is a nice, like, curve filler, like, we need something that fits, that works for that deck. And in those decks, this is almost always just going to be a 3/4 Vigilance for 3, which is just kind of awesome. Outside of that deck, he's kind of meh. He's usually going to be a 1/4, right? He does have Vigilance, which is nice. He does count as an outlaw, which is nice, so keep those things in mind. But it's going to be a lot better in that other deck, obviously. Next up, we have Spring Splasher. 1 blue and 1 for a 2/1 Frog Beast. Whenever it attacks, target creature defending player controls gets -3/-0 until end of turn. I actually kind of like this. If you're in a deck that doesn't have a lot of creatures, they're not going super wide, being able to, you know, reduce the attack by 3 on one of their creatures is pretty key. They need a 4-power creature at least in order to block and kill your Spring Splasher. This is obviously going to be a lot better in an aggro deck. The more creatures you get down that are swinging in at the opponent, the more value you get off this -3. Because then not only does that thing not block this as well, it doesn't block any of your attackers as well, right? So if it lets some of your other attackers also get through for damage, that's where this card starts to kind of really shine. So if there's any kind of a blue and another color, dual color, like very, very aggressive, low to the ground, fast deck, this could actually be a decent card for that deck. It's still not going to be a high pick. You're going to pick it up late in the draft, but it could really help fill out those curve slots if your deck is aggressive enough and be pretty good. Next up, we have Step Between Worlds. 2 blue and 3 for a sorcery. Each player may shuffle their hand and graveyard into their library. Each player who does draws 7 cards, and then you exile Step Between Worlds. And you can plot it for 2 blue and 4. So this is kind of a time twister that has the potential to be played for free if you plot it, which is kind of crazy. That being said, its plot cost is really expensive, so it's really kind of hard to do that. But in the right decks, you could absolutely make this work. The one card I think of that this works super well with is Sheoldred, because it's a May for your opponents, right? So if you plot this and then just play it for free, now your opponents have to choose. What you could do is just play Sheoldred the same turn you play this for free, so that they don't see it coming, so that they don't have time to react and kill the Sheoldred. And then you play this, and now they have to choose, like, if they draw 7 cards, they're taking 14 damage. That might just be enough to kill them, and they can't choose to draw the cards no matter what, right? But then even if they do have more than 14 life, that's going to be a very difficult decision that's going to bring them to very low life totals with a Sheoldred on the board, which would be kind of insane. So most of the time, they're just going to have to choose not to. So you just draw 7 and gain 14 life with your Sheoldred in play. I think that's where this is going to best be used. Outside of seeing use with Sheoldred, this is probably too expensive and probably a little too cute. But if there are other ways you think this card could be utilized and, you know, really abused, let me know in the comments, because Sheoldred is an obvious one, and if this sees play, it'll probably be with Sheoldred. But if there's anything else that I'm missing, let me know in the comments for sure, because this is an interesting card. I do love Time Twister. I used to own one, had to sell it during quarantine. Long story, bad memories, don't want to go there. But Step Between Worlds, cool card. Use it with Sheoldred. Next up, we have Stoic Sphinx. 2 blue and 2 for a 5/3 Sphinx with flash and flying. That's really good. But it has hexproof as long as you haven't cast a spell this turn. Granted, the hexproof is situational, but it's still hexproof. It's still gravy in addition to the other stuff. So I just think this card is nuts. You can cast it at the end of your opponent's turn and then immediately swing with it on your turn, right? And then if you don't cast any spells on your turn, it's going to have hexproof on your turn while it's swinging, no matter what. Likewise, on their turn, it's almost always going to have hexproof, right? They're going to have instant speed removal to deal with this, and even then, only after you've cast a spell. If you just never need to cast a spell again, they can't ever kill this, unless they sweep the board, of course. But what's cool about it, too, is you can hold up counter magic. So, like, they can't kill it, and then if they try to cast something too problematic, you counter it, and now they can kill it, but they just used their mana to play their other thing. So they don't have the mana to kill it. And then when they pass the turn, now it's a new turn, it has hexproof again. So even if they were able to kill it, they can't kill it, right? So there's so many ways to line up the hexproof in ways that are just really obnoxious for your opponent. I want to test this out for sure. This could be a new blue finisher, but it's going to be really interesting trying to figure out the best play lines and how to force your opponent to play around this and just how effective it will actually be. It's going to be really hard to gauge that until we actually use it and we actually see it in action. So I can't say for sure how good this card is going to be, but it has the potential to be insanely good and a good finisher for control specifically because of the different play lines you can set up with protection for him. Just having a 5-power flying evasive guy that can finish the game pretty quickly is going to be pretty gnarly. So could be a cool finisher for control decks. We'll have to wait and see. Next up, we have Stop Cold. 1 blue and 3 for an enchantment aura with flash. It enchants an artifact or creature, and when it enters the battlefield, you tap that permanent and it loses all abilities and doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. We've seen this ability before. But I think all of this stacked onto one card, even with it being 4 mana, makes it a little bit better than what we're used to. 4 mana is a lot though. But in Limited, that mana isn't as bad, right? And that's where this is going to see play. This is obviously not going to see play in Constructed. So in Limited, being able to not only play this at instant speed, but make sure the thing that you target gets tapped down by this, just in case they have a creature with Vigilance or something like that. And not only does it not untap, but it also loses all its abilities, so you can hit certain artifacts that have really powerful abilities you're scared of, even if they're not creatures. There's just a lot of versatility here, and you can use it at instant speed and potentially blow out an opponent in certain ways. So I just think it's pretty good. It's still filler. It's still common filler. But if you're coming up light on removal in your blue whatever deck, you could do a lot worse than to, you know, add this in as your last card to kind of shore up those problems and shore up your defenses and make it a solid rounded deck. Next up, we have Take the Fall. This is 1 blue mana for an instant. Target creature gets -1/-0 until end of turn. It gets -4/-0 until end of turn instead if you control an outlaw, and you draw a card. So what makes this card so good is just that it's a 1 mana instant speed draw card, right? It's basically Opt with upside. Granted, you don't get the scry, but in Limited, in a format where your deck size is so much smaller, being able to draw cards is that much more important because you get that much closer to your bombs that much quicker, and it's really important. So I think this is actually really good, especially if you're in Outlaw Tribal. That's where this really shines. I don't know. It probably only sees play in decks that really want you to be able to cast cheap spells, like the double spell deck, things like that, or in Outlaw Tribal, where you're actually getting a relevant ability. Because in Outlaw Tribal, being able to give something -4 attack, that could be a blowout in combat for sure. You can easily, like, block in a way where they don't think you're going to block because your guy will die, and your guy's better than their guy, but now your guy doesn't die. And because of that, you're able to kill their guy, but then you're also drawing a card and cantripping, and all of that's just costing you 1 mana. So I think if you care about casting a bunch of spells a turn, this is going to be a great cantrip for that, but also Outlaw Tribal, sanely easy way to get a nice combat trick in for just 1 mana that replaces itself with another card. So in those archetypes, pick this relatively high. Outside of those archetypes, meh. Next up, we have the Key to the Vault. 1 blue and 1 for a legendary artifact equipment. It equips for 1 blue and 2. So that is a lot of mana. That's 5 mana to finally get this onto a creature, right? But whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, look at that many cards from the top of your library. You may exile a non-land card from among them, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. So for limited, this is obviously a slam dunk. This will win you games, but it's a rare, so that's expected. In constructed, this is kind of a trap. It's hard to use. Like, 5 mana is a lot to not impact the board in any way, and removal is everywhere, so the chances that you're actually able to get through with your equipped creature before they kill it and just make you have to dump even more mana to equip it to something else, pretty low. That being said, the power level is super high, and it's possible that maybe, it does seem like there's a lot of powerful equipments in this set. It might be possible to brew some kind of a new equipment tribal style deck that makes something like this cost less or give you extra value on playing it, things like that. And maybe that puts this just over the top enough to kind of make it viable. I could see that happening. I could see a world where that's a thing, because the equipment in this set is looking super powerful. There's one in colorless and one that's multicolor that we'll get to in some of the other set review videos that are just kind of wacky and crazy and really good. The multicolor one in particular is going to be really good even outside of equipment tribal, but if we have that kind of quality of equipment, it might finally be time for an equipment tribal deck to be real, and if it does, this does have potential of slotting into that, so we'll have to wait and see. Wizards has been trying to make an equipment tribal deck work in standard for a long time. They've given support every single set, and it just never quite gets there. It's never quite powerful enough for it to finally break into the meta. Is this the set that's going to do it? I don't know. We'll find out, but that's probably the only way this card could see play in constructed. Next up, we've got This Town Ain't Big Enough. 1 blue and 4 for an instant. It costs 3 less to cast if it targets a permanent you control. Return up to 2 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands. I kinda love this card because it's so flexible. Like, you can target their super problematic permanent that you need to get out of there for a while, and your thing that has an ETB trigger, so that you can put it back in your hand and replay it, all at instant speed for only 2 mana. You could also play this in response to removal, so instead of your guy dying, you bounce it to your hand, only paying 2 mana, and then also get to bounce something else, their most problematic creature, or maybe another card of yours that you want to replay and ETB. Even just playing this for 2 mana and getting to return 2 of your ETB creatures to your hand and replay them could be kind of nuts in limited. So there's just a lot of versatility here, on top of the fact that if you just need to, you can pay the full 5 mana and get rid of 2 permanents temporarily for just 1 card. When you add up all of the ways this can be used, it's going to be pretty awesome. I think this card is awesome. Instant speed is huge on it, so keep that in mind. Obviously, it's better if you're in the ETB deck. If you're in the ETB deck, the Flash Flicker, archetype in limited, you want as many of these as you can get your hands on, because being able to slow down your opponent while also doing the stuff you want to do for very cheap is going to be really important in that deck. So slam it in there, pick it high. Outside of that, it's some decent filler if you need some removal in your blue deck. Next up, we've got 3 Steps Ahead. This is another card that was almost picked for, like, best of, maybe not best of, maybe like runner-up, but one of the better cards in the set. This is 1 blue mana for an instant with Spree. For an extra 1 blue and 1, you counter target spell. So full stop there. This is just a 3 mana counter spell, which is on rate and kind of a thing. Granted, we don't have any of the little silver lining value that usually comes alongside a 3 mana rare counter spell, but still, getting to spend 3 mana to counter any spell, just full stop without any stipulations whatsoever, is pretty on rate, and it's pretty good there. So if that's our floor that we're working from, this card's already pretty good. But then for plus 3 mana, create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control. So for a total of 4 mana, you could just clone something. You could just pay the same mana as a clone to make a copy like a clone. So it's just like an on-rate clone, but it can be an artifact or a creature, not just a creature. That seems pretty good, although I guess clone abilities these days are less expensive than clone, right? I think the going rate is 3, so it is a little bit more expensive to do the clone. But your clone also having the potential to be a counterspell instead, almost in a charm fashion in the right circumstance, that's pretty good, right? And then for plus 2, you draw 2 cards and discard a card, so you get card advantage. All of these modes are good. All of these modes are even better late game when you can cast them for a lot cheaper. I think of using it with something like Hinata. If we have a Hinata on the board, which makes it cost 1 less for each target, we could use the first 2 modes for only a total of 4 mana. We could spend 4 mana, counter a spell, and make a token that's a copy of any artifact or creature we control, and that seems kind of crazy. I just think there's a lot of ways for this to be used. It just seems super fun and super effective. I would be very surprised if this didn't show up in some blue control decks somewhere as a way to have your counterspell with a ton of versatility and upside. Next up, we have Visage Bandit. 1 blue and 3. I always want to say Visage Bandit because it just sounds cooler, but I guess that's not the right way to pronounce it, which makes me really sad. So Visage Bandit. This is actually my pick for my favorite card of the set in blue, which is surprising because it's an uncommon, but 1 blue and 3 for a 2/2 Shapeshifter Rogue, so it does count as an outlaw, and it enters the battlefield as a copy of any creature you control, except it's a Shapeshifter Rogue in addition to its other types, and then it plots for 1 blue and 2. So not only is it, a 4 mana clone that also stays an outlaw and gets all of your outlaw synergies, even if it clones something that isn't an outlaw, which is huge with all of the outlaw synergies that are running around in this set, but you could just plot this for 3 mana and then play it for free later, which lines up perfectly with what you're trying to do, because as you're curving out, you plot this for a little cheaper than it would cost to play it, leave it in exile, and then when you finally play your bomb creature, you play this for free. Like, you can tap out for your big nasty creature and still play this for free the same turn and make it become a copy of that big bomby creature. I just think the ability to line it up that way, or to just slam it if you top deck it and get the creature that very turn, like the versatility of being able to do it either way, makes this card really good. And the fact that it stays an outlaw makes it really good. I think this card's just super overlooked. This could also be a decent pick for a sleeper, to be completely honest, but it's my pick for favorite in blue. I just think there's so much you can do with it. The main thing that I want to do with this is make a standard legal plot-centric deck, where what we're going to do is we're going to plot a bunch of creatures, including Visage Bandit, and then on turn 5, maybe even earlier if we have a little bit of ramp, I'm not sure yet, we'll see, you just slam Terror of the Peaks, and then you play this for 0 and make a copy of Terror of the Peaks, and then if you play any other plot creatures, they double trigger both your Terror of the Peaks. That just seems bananas. So I don't know, we got to brew something like that for sure. But Visage Bandit, my pick for my favorite card in blue for this set. I think it's gnarly, and I can't wait to build around it. And the last card in blue is World Walker Helm. 1 blue and 2 for an artifact. If you would create 1 or more artifact tokens, instead create those tokens plus an additional map token. You can also tap this and pay 1 blue and 1 to make a token that's a copy of target artifact token you control. There's so many ways of making big busted artifact tokens now that this activated ability is so abusable, right? Not only is it abusable to make something huge out of nowhere by making a copy of any big artifact token, whether it's, you know, Thousand Moon Smithy, or the blue version of Thousand Moon Smithy that we saw a few cards ago, or, you know, just anything that makes a token copy of anything in play, like 2-drop Saheeli can make a copy of something that counts as an artifact. You just target your biggest creature, your big bomb, you make a token copy of that, and then you can use this to make another copy of that token copy because it counts as an artifact. Like, there's just so many crazy big plays you can do with this, but even just smaller stuff, even just using it, I don't know, in an Oni called Anvil deck or whatever, and just like copying something small and then also getting a map token just seems crazy. Every single time you make an artifact token, you get an extra artifact token because of the static ability. Like, that ability alone could be really good in the right deck. In Oni called Anvil, you're just making fodder constantly to fuel your anvils or to fuel other sacrifice synergies. Like, the potential here to just go super wide with artifact tokens is nuts, but the fact that you can go super tall with making tokens of really big crazy things, because there's so many different cards that have that built in now that are available in standard that can support the helm in that way. Like, you kind of have the best of both worlds with this card. And the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that maybe this should have gotten an award. But I don't know. We're going to have to brew something first before we make that decision. But my decisions stand as they are right now. I think this card is super great. I'm excited to brew with it. My dog is so excited. He's shaking his head at me. And that's it for blue. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Did I miss anything? Is there a card that you think is crazy that I'm crazy for not thinking is crazy? Let me know in the comments. Do you think any of my choices for best picks are I'm out of my mind and I'm overlooking something that's better? Let me know all that stuff in the comments. Make sure to like the video if you haven't already, because like I said before, it helps me so much, like way more than I can possibly explain with words. I just really need this video to get out to as many people as possible, because it just takes so much time and energy to put these together, and I'm trying, guys. I'm grinding like crazy, but I really need your help, so thank you if you've done that. Subscribe if you're new. I got tons of content coming, more set review videos, ton of new brews. We're going to hit the ground running when the new set launches. It's an exciting time for Magic, so stay tuned. White is up next. We'll see you there. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there. And if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.